Yeah? Okay, now it's working. Okay, hello and welcome to the New Paradigms panel. Welcome to the first day of our conference of Transmediale. My name is Daphne Dragona. I'm the curator of this year's conference. So the conference this year focuses on the emerging environments, ecologies and hybridities that manifest the relationship of the human and the non-human that is closer than ever before. Following the overall theme of the festival, we explore how media have become environmental as they're fully integrated into our everyday lives in ways that we can hardly feel or grasp. And we emphasize this new condition of constant and immediate mediation occurring often beyond our control. Within this context, we are asking how aware are we or can we be of these new processes within these environments, and particularly looking into what is our role within them. An important point that I would like to make while introducing this panel is that, of course, many of the notions, the key notions, the relationships and the phenomenon that we are discussing in this conference are, of course, not new. The need to talk of ecologies, of environments, to approach the relationship of the human to the machine and to critically engage with the role of artificial intelligence are all aspects that have been addressed in different contexts and different moments, and we revisit them again today with the scope, within the scope of the naturalization of technology, of the technology being felt as natural. So the following panel is of great interest of us, as it has as its starting point what we could describe as an environment of knowledge. And this is the timeline project of the Technopolitics Working Group, which is hosted at NGBK until the 5th of February. This is one of our main partner projects for this year. And this 12-meter timeline, it's in a way linear and transversal at the same time, as it depicts the development of information society with around 500 entries that come from different contributors who are bringing in their own interests and knowledge and allowing therefore different connections and associations. So the panel in a way I think follows the logic of the timeline and highlights this importance of looking into older and newer paradigms when discussing the phenomena and the processes of today's media ecologies. Before passing the microphone to Felix, I would like to warmly thank Armin Midosh, who could not travel to Berlin, as he curated this panel and organized with us the presentation, the exhibition of the timeline of NGBK. So our moderator for this panel will be Felix Stalder, who is a professor for digital culture at the Zurich University of the Arts, a senior researcher at the World Information Institute in Vienna. He's also the moderator of the mailing list NetTime since 1995. His work focuses on the intersection of cultural, political, and technological dynamics, and has a special interest on new modes of commons-based production, copyright, and the transformation of subjectivity. He's the author and editor of a number of books. Among them are Manuel Castells and Theory of Network Society, Deep Search, The Politics of Search Beyond Google, and Culture de Digitalitat, which was published in 2016. Thank you very much. Enjoy the panel.
Hello, also from my side. Welcome to the Techno Politics New Paradigms panel. Before we start with our three main contributors, let me give you a... Right, eventually will come. Okay, let me tell you briefly something about timeline and project as a whole, so you get a bit of a context of why we're talking about these things in the way we do for the next 2 hours. Daphne already mentioned that Armin Midosh couldn't be here, but he sent us a little text about Technopolitics. As a brief introduction, I'll simply read that out and then I'll tell a bit what we have done over the last week. And this in some ways a part of a of a series of events around this timeline. So, Technopolitics is an attempt at analyzing and understanding large-scale social transformations, how they develop and transform, on which contingencies and conditions they depend. While this endeavor respects the achievements of academic disciplines, it cannot restrict itself to disciplinary boundaries. Technopolitics tries to break new ground by developing new discursive formats between art and science. The project presented here at NGBK, Tracing Information Society, a timeline, is one such specific attempt. The format of the timeline, which you can see here, allows us to develop a multifaceted discussion about the current social transformation, which we refer to as information society. The obvious restraints of that format of the timeline imposes on us has the advantages that it facilitates collaborative thinking and collective analysis without a shared hegemonic theory of information society. By using this already hollow-out shell of a term, information society, we want neither to resuscitate nor glorify it. Since its inception, information society has served as a myth which promises to overcome the shortcomings of industrial society. Now the high-speed train of information progress still powers on, propelled by terms such as big data, Industry 4.0, automation, robotization, and so on. Yet for Technopolitics, it is clear that this is already a mature paradigm reaching potentially its saturation. Something new is breeding inside existing societies, which has not yet a name or a clear social form. Our hope is that by tracing the emergence of the information society, we may understand better the social and historical forces which also bring out this new paradigm. However, such attempts at thinking the longue durée may be brutally cut short by political events such as the rise of neo-authoritarianism or even neo-fascism in the West. We will see if this is a storm that blows over before it does too much damage, or if it may even galvanize a new global opposition movement capable of developing a new politics beyond short-term protest. So much Armin. On a somewhat more mundane note, what we did at NGBK was that we produced this timeline. It starts with 1900 and has about 500 entries. Both the starting point 1900 and the number of entries is purely conventional. We just picked a round number to start, 1900, and a round number of entries that we're somehow capable of putting kind of on a visual display. This timeline is not the end result of our research projects. It's not a claim that we identified the 500 most important events of the last 100 years, but rather it's an ongoing discussion and research framework. So when we show it, it's for us really important that it's displayed physically inside kind of a gallery or an exhibition space, because we want very much to assemble people in front of it and move physically along the timeline as we go up and down, the 116 years that we cover. And the timeline is a very, in a way, a very stupid format. It has no analytical power. It doesn't say anything more than event X happened at particular time, but through that it generates a lot of questions that you cannot, or that the timeline as a way of organizing this information cannot answer. And these questions are for us more interesting than the timeline itself, because it's something that generates a framework for research that we conduct then inside or through workshops that we do in the space, through lectures, and that's why a table that is as long as the timeline is an integral part. So we can assemble around it, sit there, read materials that are put on the table. Also it has audiovisual material, but most importantly, sit around it and discuss specific aspects of this large-scale development that we want to trace. And there are a number of questions that are invariably triggered. And these are questions that cannot be answered by the timeline. One such question is, if event X is included, why is event Y not included? This invariably, and quite often we think, oh yeah, perhaps we could include it, but it is already full. So then the next question is, if we want to include that, which one should we take out? And then you're immediately in a discussion, and since this is a very collaborative effort, the different events that are on the timeline are each claim significance according to a different analytical framework. So suddenly you end in discussions of how do you relate a technological event to a cultural event? How do you relate kind of a large-scale economic process to a particular event? So these are discussions that we don't have definite answers, but provide an environment in which we can discuss them. A second question that invariably comes up is, if several events occur in the same year, or maybe in the same kind of group of years, do they have something in common? Because the timeline, again, cannot answer this. The timeline only traces occurrences. So it could be a coincidence, or it could kind of indicate that there are underneath larger kind of structural processes that have effects, or that materialize them in different areas, in different forms, but still belong to the same large-scale historical process. This again is something that the timeline is kind of an associative machine. It creates a number of speculations that this could be, but whether this is actually the case, you can only kind of ascertain through debate and research, and by bringing in additional material beyond this very short kind of entries that we have in there. And now bringing us to the panel here, another question that always comes up is, okay, if you can map in a way, or at least trace in a way, such a large-scale development, doesn't that indicate that it's already over? It is kind of the Minerva's owl, kind of sets off at dawn. So somehow you can only see things in retrospect. And again, this is a question that we cannot answer, but the entire project started around 2011 with a clear understanding that following the crash of 2008, we moved into a large-scale crisis. This crisis has not yet been resolved, but produces ever-mounting kind of effects. We all know them. I don't have to list them here. And so there is clear that there is a non-discontinuity that we are living through, but it's unclear what this is. And it's unclear whether this is just a further transformation within this large-scale concept, because also the information society, whatever this means, is not a static kind of historical phase that is more or less unchanged, but has a lot of internal phases itself. So this might be just a new rearranging within a large-scale paradigm, or it might be something that a new paradigm is coming up that has not yet found its social form, as Armin put it. And this is the starting point for our discussion today. Because if we say we can observe certain historical developments that are now coming to the fore, that become now much more dominant and are part of a large-scale rearranging of kind of techno-science, but also of economy and also of cultural sensitivities and interests and potentials, then these new paradigms, these new kind of ways of organizing the environment, so to speak, have a prehistory. They're already here. They've already been developed for 10, 20, 30, maybe even more years, but they are now coming together in a way that creates something that's distinctly different. And this is what we want to talk about. So from this question, if it's already over, what are the driving forces to create a new environment? And I'm very happy with my panel tonight, or this afternoon, this morning, I guess. Sorry, it's dark and such a dark room, and at least Gerald, I know, is jet lagged, and it kind of affects me too. So very strongly. So what we're going to do, we have 3 presenters. Each of them has about 20 minutes to present, think about one of those strands that have a prehistory and are now becoming more dominant or transform themselves. And then we have about half an hour or so for an open discussion. So my first guest, so to speak, let me introduce, is Yuta Weber. She's a science and technology studies scholar, philosopher, and a media theorist. Since 2011, she works as a professor for media sociology at the University of Paderborn. Before that, she taught at several centers of gender studies and also at the Department of Computer Science. I mention this only to give you a sense of the particular interdisciplinary backgrounds that Yuta Weber can mobilize. Among her most recent publications and most relevant to the discussion here are Human-Machine Autonomies, which is a contribution to a book on autonomous weapon systems, and an article called Keep Adding, Kill Lists, Drone Warfare, and the Politics of Databases. Without much further ado, please welcome Yuta Weber.
Yeah, thank you very much, Felix, and also warm thanks to Armin Medosh for organizing this panel. So greetings. I'm not sure whether we're streamed. The session is streamed if Armin can listen. So many greetings to Vienna and for giving us this wonderful opportunity to discuss. As Felix already introduced, I found this project very interesting, the timeline. I haven't only recently been invited to the timeline, and I found it an interesting way to address specific problems. And I think that the topic I'm addressing tonight, tonight, this afternoon, it's too dark, this room. One of the entries I wanted to have in the timeline, and I think now it's in the timeline, is the document by Gilles Deleuze on postscript to the controlled society. And then and I was quite sure it's already in the timeline, must be part of the information society timeline, and it was not. So I was, hooray. I'm not, don't be scared, I'm not talking about Gilles Deleuze because it's going to be a bit hard. But I want to talk not so much about warfare like my recent papers were about, but more like the topic of techno security or techno security culture, which I think is one of the, you could say, new, not so new, because I would say it's maybe for the last 3 or 4 decades an enormous important topic, but I think it's an important part of the information society, and also not only since Snowden, but for quite a while, as I said before. Before going into this, and maybe I have to cut some of my parts, because also the very nice introduction by Felix gave me reason to maybe explain a few things when you said, how can we connect technology or technological events and social events? I think what I try to do is to understand the epistemological and ontological groundings, not only of technologies, but also of frames of thought. So how do we experience, for example, I like this discourse and it's interesting, but in, for example, in media studies or in also a recent philosophical discussion, we use a lot the metaphor of environment, for example. So I'm interested in what specific historic times we are using, which kind of ideas, frames of thoughts, topics, and this might be related also to specific technologies that come up to a specific time in history, and try to figure out whether there are specific connections between frames of thoughts, technologies, and so on. Talking about longue durée, the historians would say, so large-scale historical or societal developments, yeah, and that's also about thinking about epistemic regimes of a time. I think it's a very relevant question. And for many decades, we were so much into micro-politics that we stopped thinking about a bigger frame. So I think this is very interesting, but I think there are lots of paradigms, and maybe information society. For me, for example, technoscience, like Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway introduced, and maybe it's hard to say which are the more relevant, but I think we don't need to. It's not a competition. So just to give you some of the background, and then I start, and Felix will kind of wave if I run out of time. And thank you for coming, by the way. So, security today is increasingly reconfigured as maximum high-tech security, relying widely on surveillance technologies to fight risks ranging from terrorism and crime to theft and so-called antisocial behavior. In parallel, surveillance technologies have become integrated in social media practices such as location sharing, profiling, or tagging. Technology plays increasingly a central role in security discourses and practices. We are living, I would say, in a techno-security culture which is profoundly shaped by the impact of high-tech surveillance technologies and social media, which are also partly surveillance technologies, the epistemologies and techno-imaginaries. Armand Montellard coined the term techno-security to point towards the globalization of surveillance already around 2003, I think, and especially the techno-fetishism of recent military theory. But I would like to use the term in a broader sense, and I will ask first, how is security, not security technology, but also security, reconfigured as techno-security? How do techno-scientific epistemologies, which are embedded in surveillance technologies, configure this culture? And through which techno-imaginaries is techno-security mediated, as we are also using social media? Or the other way around, surveillance is no more only a top-down phenomenon, but also a bottom-up phenomenon. And I think social media play a very important part in this. Okay, techno-security is a complex socio-political practice as a situated and heterogeneous process in which many different agents, not only institutions, but also algorithms, concepts, machines, or humans, produce meanings and norms. In this process, specific values get inscribed while others are left out. Important questions are, how do technological standards and categories impact this concept of security, this design of security architectures, and also our everyday life? Which anxieties, pleasures, and promises are transported by surveillance technologies, and how is social media packed into techno-imaginaries? Do techno-security practices make surveillance pleasurable? So also to ask from the other side. The feeling of being at risk has become frequent in Western societies and has made security an overall concern. I mean, think of standing at the main station in any German city, and they're always asking you, you should take care of your luggage, and it's a security issue. So it really becomes a part of everyday life, and I think many people today are scared if there's a big suitcase or a big backpack and they don't know to whom it belongs, So you can really feel how this became part of everyday life, and I would say this has been different 30 years, for example, ago. So, feeling of being at risk has become frequent in Western societies and has made security an overall concern. As security expectations are permanently rising, security has become governed by a precautionary logic warning of the dangers of the future, and by attempts to manage contingency and unpredictability. As risks are increasingly experienced as limitless, demands for preemptive techno-security measures are spreading. In parallel, security is less regarded as a social or ecological issue, but it's conceptualized as maximum security obtainable by high-tech total surveillance. Technology is so far considered the silver bullet for security issues. Security and surveillance technologies converge. They are used to monitor, track, search, and profile almost every realm of society, from economy, politics, military to everyday life. CCTV, RFID chips, that's very funny. When I got this, how to say for this in English, I was asking the woman at the front desk, is there an RFID chip in it? She said, not yet. So that's what I was thinking of. CCTV, RFID chips, drones or scanners are used to search for terrorists, monitor sport events, grant access to ATMs, and control employees. Simultaneously, social media has made monitoring an everyday event. Millions of people are using Facebook and the security button, the safe button, not the security button. Locative media like Foursquare, jogging trackers, or apps to track the cell phone of a partner. In parallel, huge amounts of data are collected, sorted, and processed not only by state authorities but also by private companies for predictive and future analysis. The hope is to gather new information, discover hidden patterns, and to connect the dots in the hope of preempting the future political as well as economic risks. Meanwhile, online users are sharing data, tracking the movement of others, or being tracked themselves. Some seem to enjoy the comforting gaze of the other or the self-reflective loops of social monitoring. Surveillance technologies are not only, as I said before, operated top-down by state authorities, but used in diverse interactive ways. They are embedded in rich techno-imaginaries, full of promises, anxieties, and pleasures. For example, the promise of global interconnectivity or so-called crowd wisdom, and the visual pleasures, for example, of the satellite overview. But also there's a fear of, as Jordan Crandall calls it, the fear of not being watched. Insofar, I believe that the culture of techno-security is governed not only by a restrictive, but also as a pleasurable regime of power. Security has been described as today's ontotheology. We are afraid, as I said before, of orphan suitcases at the train station, suspicious people on the airplane, whatever that means, epidemics, or being robbed on the way home. In the course of broad political, socio-economic, and technological changes, security has gained a central place in the ways we think about and perceive the world. Into the 21st century, preemptive security has been normalized, and risk management has become an everyday affair. As early as 1986, Ulrich Beck claimed the rise of the so-called risk society, another society, not the society information, but the risk society, in which potential threats such as nuclear disasters or global warming induced by accelerated techno-scientific processes are no longer calculable, quantifiable, and predictable. Anthony Giddens pointed to the growing preoccupation, I think that's an important point, the growing preoccupation of Western societies with its future or its futures, thereby generating the feeling of risk. The future is perceived as catastrophic, and the world is being mapped as constantly endangered. Some security studies scholars also point out that societies are becoming progressively heterogeneous, while personal and social relations and controls are weakened. And maybe it's important to remember, and I think I found it interesting when I talked about this topic with my students, they said we had a time, let's think of the beginning of the 20th century when we had big narratives of progress, of engineers being very optimistic, of making our world better, which now breaks down to little innovative ideas which might a further app for your smartphone. But I think these grand narratives of progress are also vanishing, and this grand narrative of a potential catastrophic future, I think, takes more and more over, at least some discourses I'm looking at. Consequently, risk discourses are increasingly enlarged. The structural demand for knowledge relating to risk becomes insatiable, as O'Malley states it, as well because the accumulation of such knowledge adds awareness to new sources of risk. The risk knowledge process gains its own internal momentum. Risk discourses do not only address health, natural and technological disasters, but terrorism, organized crime, so-called illegal immigration, and so on. While security was traditionally achieved primarily via the empirical identification assessment of threats framed by a causal logic, it's now reconfigured in the logic of a predictive maximum techno security. As risks are increasingly experienced as limitless, demands for these preemptive techno security measures are spreading. And I quote Lucia Sina, "Security is less about reacting to, controlling or prosecuting crime or catastrophe than addressing the conditions precedent to it. The logic of security dictates earlier and earlier interventions to reduce opportunity, to target harden, and to increase surveillance even before the commission of crime or the event of a disaster is a distant prospect." Quote end. Technology then often serves as the solution to the growing demands for security. Surveillance, the preventive and extensive control of space, movement and behavior is more and more at the heart of security and is being normalized in everyday life. The shift of security from a proactive to a preventive mode in which every thinkable event is imagined. And I think this is important. It's not about highly probable events, it's about any thinkable event, which might not be very probable. I think there's really a shift in it. It's imagined in order to preempt it, coincides with a desire for technological superiority and situational awareness, bearing striking affinities with the contemporary military logic of security in this wish for situational awareness and technological superiority. Interpreting the world as governed by ubiquitous risks and permanent uncertainty proliferates needs for maximum technology-oriented security. Mapping our world as completely as possible is characteristic of the culture of techno-security, as all kinds of information are crowdsourced and proliferated. We generate big data to produce knowledge and to understand the complexity and multiplicity of our world, but also to govern the future, to premediate any action, and to preempt risks. But regarding technology as the silver bullet ignores that technology is always a heterogeneous network practice, which is also negotiated by, and that was Daphne in the beginning, by humans as well as non-humans, and they're never stable. Material technologies are shaping our interpretation of the world, our identities, and our ways of life. With contemporary technosciences, traditional epistemologies and ontologies have been reformulated. They are ignoring the intrinsic properties of organisms and refraining from the objective description of universal laws, while centering on the production of emergent processes. And these are the epistemologies and ontologies I want to address. I was talking in the beginning. Evolution via tinkering, the processes of trial and error, and search heuristics are the main tools constructing complex dynamic systems and are beyond the analysis and control, the ways they analyzed and controlled in the traditional sciences. This new techno-rationality uses processes of adaptation, imitation, and imagination and tries to resource the unpredictable and attempts to find possibilities for exploiting surplus processes in a technical way. These new features also characterized our techno security culture. Security is less interested in the empirical causal assessment of threats than you're thinking of, well, maybe not well defined, but of concrete threats, not of any kind of possible or impossible threats. So security was interested in the empirical causal assessment of threats, but now it concentrates of the preemption of the so-called unknowns. Computer simulation, scenario planning techniques, data mining, and worst-case imagination are used to work on uncertainty and unpredictable risks, and the logic of preemption prioritizes the power of imagination over the power of fact, suspicions over evidence. Imagination and design of improbable scenarios on the basis of incremental and automatized processes of recombination are the epistemological grounding for today's risk management. Thus, automatized technologies of predictive analysis, real-time tracking and targeting are regarded as the adequate choices to handle the challenge of unpredictable risks fueling the desire for technological superiority. And I'm now running a bit out of time, but I think what I want to add, and I will add this more in the discussion, is that this is not only this top-down phenomenon, but that we are also more and more interested in collecting data, being part of this preemptive behavior. And what I found very interesting was this introduction of the save button in Facebook, where a friend of mine, she was called at night by a friend when there was this attack in Berlin, and she hadn't used the save button on her Facebook profile, and the friend was really nervous. And I think what's going on, and how are we part of this techno security culture when we are, for example, so much relying or so much even disturbed if people are not working or functioning along this idea of the preemptive techno security culture. So thanks for your patience, and I think I gave back to
Thank you, Jutta. You already answered one question I wanted to ask you about kind of a symbolic event that kind of captures this shift that you were talking about into a different security environment. And you answered that with the Facebook Save button that kind of pops up into everyday life and refers to a different idea of what security is and how it is organized and our own implications in it. I think we can come back to that in the discussion again. But this would be for me a perfect kind of timeline entry, because it allows everything starts much earlier. But the question is, or one of the possible questions is, when does it reach a certain level where you can say, okay, now we entered into something that is part of a new environment, and that seems to me very much to be a part of a new environment, whether we like it or not. But let me introduce now Gerald Nessler. Gerald is an artist and researcher and a core member of the Technopolitics Working Group. He has been working for many years on finance, in particular on derivatives, not the least in the context of his PhD at Goldsmith University, which he's going to defend next week. So good luck for that. Some of you in Berlin might know his work from the exhibition Forensis, which was shown here at HKW about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Among his most recent publications is a special issue of the journal Finance and Society on art and finance, and he has edited together with Armen Avanassian the recent Mehrweh publication, The Making of Finance. So please welcome Gerald Nessler.
Thank you. Thank you, Felix, for the introduction. Thank you, Daphne, and the team of Transmediale for having us here. I might like to add that the special issue on art and finance I co-edited with Suhail Malik. Some of you might know he's professor at Goldsmith in the art department and someone who has also been publishing and working on finance for many, many years. I think I will speak mainly about a project or a research that I have done very recently at an artistic research day in New York for half a year at ISCP that I did with Sylvia Eckermein, my partner. That is because it's something, first of all, it kind of really is at the core of many developments now, and it marries some of my artistic, my research, and theoretical interests. I will still give a very brief, maybe, timeline or kind of development of finance in the last 30, 40 years to connect this latest research with its history. And maybe we start with a very quick intro into actually the video that I did for this exhibition for Forensis for 2 or 3 years ago. It's just 2 minutes, and it's more or less more something to wake you up again or kind of give you a historic moment that in the meantime I think has become probably very famous. It's in 2010, and it shows the more emotional side of the abstract machine of algorithmic finance.
$10.53, so 90 handles, that's too much. 40 been bid here now, guys. 40. You're talking about 1,000 dial points. You know, it's just too much.
This is the voice of Ben Lichtenstein. He reports live from the futures trading floors in Chicago, USA, for traders who are not locals but spread around the world.
Paper came in, huge paper sellers coming through here, guys. We got fast market up on the board.
It is May the 6th, 2010, and his voice is about to become known beyond the secretive world of financial markets.
Are trading here now, guys, all the way down. Guys, 82 evens are trading. 81 evens are trading here now, guys. 79s are trading. You got 79s trading it.
You are listening to Liechtenstein's live coverage of what was later termed the flash crash, the biggest one-day market decline in financial history.
70 even bid here now, guys. 70 even bid at 80. 70. Stop it. It's got to hit a limit.
The Dow Jones Index plunged almost 1,000 points in a matter of minutes, only to recover the losses in short order.
Once again, at 75. Guys, this is probably the craziest I've seen it down here ever.
Live on TV, CNBC delivered breaking news from Wall Street to a global audience. TV pundits quickly adopted a phrase that was reported live from the trading floor.
You're there. What is the talk? What happens from here? What are people saying? Now you're down 800.
Yeah, Aaron, and they're saying, when I asked them what the heck is going on down here, I don't know. There is fear. This is capitulation, really.
The flash crash epitomized a development.
Okay, so the person, it was a person actually, Ben Lichtenstein is her name, or his name, sorry. He's speaking through what is called a Squawk box. That is a specific service for traders worldwide who cannot be on the trading pit, because some of these markets are still traded by human traders, especially derivative market like the famous VIX, which is the risk index that is traded as a futures, as an option market. And what he was witnessing for everyone globally, very emotionally, is the so-called flash crash of May 6, 2010, which is kind of like, its mythology is that it's like the first major algorithmic or automated financial crash, and it's one of the biggest crashes ever The interesting part about it is that the Dow Jones lost about 1,000 points in 4 minutes, but recovered in about 20 minutes. My interest in that was less about is it really automats that triggered that, or is it the typical human error? These are actually the two main outcomes of investigations. The human error version, of course, one could nearly say, after joint investigation of the regulatory boards, which is the SEC and the CFTC in the USA. The second one of a small data analysis company that is called Nanex, who did their own research because as data collectors, they had all the trading data, and they were so, in that sense, they were able to do a kind of forensic examination of what happened that was technologically very, very intense, because you had to, or they had to, develop algorithm bots that would go into these split seconds of the trading in these microseconds that high-frequency trading was doing. High-frequency trading is maybe one of the latest developments in finance, in modern finance, so to say. Its main paradigmatic change, I would think, was much earlier. Maybe 1973 is a year that would work very well as an indicator. First, because so many things came together. There is a political rift with the end of Bretton Woods, the oil crisis, the Cup of Rome report, and many other things that ushered in a very different kind of way of thinking in the 70s. And at the same time, developments that, especially in finance, that were new, and the derivative markets mainly, because what happened there is that this was not just an economic idea or a new way of thinking of markets. It was something that was state of the art, because technological, computer science, communication science, knowledge, and economic modeling came together and formed something until then very new. I think there is quite a nice example for that, is that one of the main people in the background of developing this form of finance is a person called Thorpe, that was a scientist in the 60s at MIT that went to casinos to scientifically prove that he could break the bank of blackjack and roulette, etc., etc. He also built the first variable computer with Shannon, Mr. Shannon, who is the father of information theory. And they went, Shannon, Thorpe, and the wife of Shannon, went to Las Vegas with this variable computer and gambled, which wasn't forbidden then, because no one expected in the mid-60s that anyone could carry a computer into any place, no, because they were huge, of course. So it was forbidden right afterwards, obviously, but it helped Thorpe finally to break the bank of blackjack, and he wrote a huge bestseller, Beat the Dealer, and proved that scientifically, as someone who wanted, or who was really interested in proving probability theory in practical life, that he could kind of like be successful. So what he did after that, he went straight into financial markets and applied his knowledge right there. And in financial markets, the whole idea of derivatives was until then more or less seen as a gamble, but an immoral gamble, because you could, for example, bet on the downfall of an American corporation, which was not just immoral, but even unpatriotic. And as we all know today, again, this is worse. No? I mean, unpatriotic is probably the worst thing you can be, again, in the United States. But what happened is that something like that, that Thorpe, that was a good one, that Thorpe invented, and other people's as well, and then led to the very famous Black-Scholes-Merton model, and formula transformed this whole thinking, the whole idea, the whole perspective, not in a sense that it wasn't gambling, it was gambling, but now it was scientifically proven gambling. And gambling was able to kind of conquer finance and from there on develop a completely new form of how one could deal with a very important term that I think today is also discussed in many, many different ways, but it comes up right at that time. That's volatility. Volatility is nothing else but risk. How can you trade risk? And there was a possibility how you can trade risk. But I only have 20 minutes, so I should kind of like go on. This ushered in a new form of trade, because financial markets until then, and a bit later on, of course, was kind of like made alive by traders, by market makers in the pits. They were dealing with each other. There was kind of like this phenomenon of imitation in the crowd and this kind of competition. What came up after that are quants, which means quantitative analysts, mathematicians, physicians, because now investment banks and hedge funds, Thorpe is actually also the person that founded the first quantitative hedge fund in 1968, I think. They needed people that were able to calculate Black-Scholes. Black-Scholes is based on physics, like heat diffusion, differentials, etc., etc. So they needed kind of physicists to come in and make the pricing happen. So this is kind of a second wave in finance until the mid-90s maybe. And at that time, again, another development appeared that now kind of like really goes into this whole idea of automation, algorithmization, for which actually the term black box stands. So a black box is something that then kind of like was invented and brought into finance as a modality that could first of all get rid of human traders, could automate the human trader, and could much quicker and much more reactive kind of deal with market situations. Primarily that was used to deal with huge orders of investment banks, so they could kind of like bring them into the market without people realizing that there was something big going on and kind of profiting from that. But of course, at the same time, that was quickly developed into an own kind of market segment to bring out specific profits through speed, low latency, and similar possibilities. One person that in that world has a very interesting history is called Chaim Bodek. Chaim is actually the son of a physicist. His father is obviously one of the most known physicists in the USA who won every prize except one. So Chaim grew up with probably having to win that specific prize. And he did everything you need to do. He studied physics, etc. But then decided to go, as quite a lot of people of his generation, into finance. That was in the early mid-90s. So the physician, Chaim Bodek, entered finance and right into one of the most innovative outlets of the time, which was called Hull Trading, who were the first to use AI algorithms and experimented with all kinds of new ways that they could implement for profiting in financial markets. He was really one of this handful of people that really make these kind of shifts happen in history. So he was one of those people that coded algorithms, especially to kind of get rid of human traders. Then he was hired by Goldman Sachs, was the head of a whole department, had this huge career, and in the early 2000s he founded his own hedge fund in high-frequency trading. And with high-frequency trading, there is an interesting shift, an interesting moment that happens there, because we could look at this on the line between cost and profit center. So first, we had traders who were, of course, the profit center of everyone who was involved in financial markets, because that is where the prices were made. And they became a cost center when quants came up, and quants took over the profit center situation. That again, with automation, algorithmization changed, and then it wasn't actually the quants that developed automation and algorithmization, but developers. So most of the automated algorithmic financial markets are developed not by quants. There is no necessity for derivative valuation and similar things, but by developers. And it's about being able to tweak speed, latency, write very simple algorithms that can kind of work very quickly. And don't have to kind of come up very quickly, enter the matching engine very quickly. So not complexity, simplicity, and speed. And that it was a speciality of Hymbodic, for example. But all of that, this whole rise, was very strongly affected by something that we would usually think is there to take care of a fairness in that kind of system, if we think that there is a fairness in the system anyway. That is called regulation. And this shows how intensely involved regulation is in such complex practices, like these kind of financial market automations today, where it's very hard to see an outside, anything like that. Regulation is actually something that completely enters into something and changes it and has an effect on that. So there's, for example, one regulation, it's called Regulation NMS, a national market system, that was implemented to give fair price to every market participant. And you have to imagine that there are 13 exchanges, regulated exchanges, more than 50 dark pools in the USA, and even then there were about 30 to 40 dark pools. Each of them, on each of them there is trade. That means there is a huge competition. Market centers are also competitive against each other. So they want to have people trading in their venues. So you have a lot of similar trades happening. So what is really important is, at least for a regulator, that everyone has the same price, that there is a fair price. So what they did, they consolidated the price in the US, which means everyone had to have the same price. But because until then, regulators were usually, had studied law or things like that, had not much idea about technology, people that were already engaged in very low latency trading practices realized very quickly that this regulation was something where you could earn money very easily, because you just had to be quicker than a consolidated tape. And for someone who was doing these kind of things, that wasn't so complicated. And that actually is the point where high-frequency trading took off and became this huge practice that to some degree really changed how finance operates and became something more known also in wider circles, 2010. And in the meantime, kind of like is something that is very normal, so to say. It's like, as I said before, you have market centers that compete. It's a competitive situation, which means that not just regulation, but also market centers are part of this whole, in that environment, in that market environment. There is no outside. They're all insiders that all deal with each other, which means, of course, that there are a lot of different interests for creating volume, creating liquidity, having it instead of someone else, etc. One more minute, two more? Okay, good, because I'm not nowhere by now. Okay, so I told you about Hymbodic. Hymbodic, because of that, became a whistleblower, and is probably the most important whistleblower in finance, because what he was able to do, first of all, he did it publicly, so he went out. He wasn't doing it anonymously. What he was doing, he was kind of like, as a total insider who really kind of worked out these kind of things, was able to give evidence to many practices that were not seen by anyone else because they actually shouldn't exist. And the project that Sylvia and me did is a collaboration with Hymbodic, or that we are doing, which is a mapping of the algo space, which is not just about like how this operates, what the algos are, how they technologically operate, how they try to use speed to be better than others, how specific practices work, but it's also about the emotional side, the visceral side of this whole field that also exists. It's not just something cold algorithmic. And what you see here is the first initial of 6, by now 6 maps in which we kind of like go through this history. And what I want to maybe share to end it, because I think that's a very interesting and important point, is that in the information capitalism, where information rules, what seems to be the paradigmatic underflow that makes it work is information asymmetry. That means manipulation, fabrication, fraud, things like that. The reason is that if you think of how these very, very quick trading technologies work, and I don't know if you know how prices are made in financial markets, but there's always a bid and an ask, and there is something that is called spread. So between a bid and an ask price, there's a small difference, because that difference is the possible profit that the market maker earns. Because in financial markets, you have market makers that have the obligation to give prices. If you don't have that, there's no price, right? So this spread is kind of like the actual node of pricing, the actual node of financial capitalism, if you like. With more and more increasingly high-frequency trading becoming the market maker, the liquidity provider, the spread is going down. It's becoming smaller and smaller. It has by far been so small that for a long time human traders cannot kind of compete with this. It's become an algorithmic practice, which means that market centers, meaning exchanges, give specific incentives to high-frequency traders to trade on their market center and create volume there. So we have very specific orders that no one else knows about. That itself is an information asymmetry and an adverse selection. And, okay, I have to finish. The point is, good, that in capitalist economics, market equilibrium is kind of like an axiom, so to say. It's a law of necessity. The interesting thing is, the less you have a spread, okay, the more you would think equilibrium is realized. And all regulators love the idea that there is no spread. But if you think further, what that means is that at the moment where there is no spread, or the most minimal spread, markets collapse. So when market capitalism gets to the point of its most successful implementation, it at the same time collapses. Which, on the other hand, means that there is a negative kind of procedure in which then market centers, the investment firms and the hedge funds have to develop other forms of making profit, which are then these specific orders, front-running, and other forms of fraud. And that is how financial markets operate today.
Gerald, thank you very much. We're still in the phase where we're just laying out things. So we will lay out a little bit more. And I'm very happy to have Gabriella Kramersberger here. She's a professor for philosophy of digital media at the University of Witten-Herdecke. Her research focuses on the influence of computation on science and society and the applicability of mathematics. She conducted an extensive study on the influence of computer-based simulation on science, in particular in the field of climate research and of cell biology. Directly relevant to today's discussion was a research project she led called Embodied Information, Living Algorithms and Cellular Machines. She's also active in the field of art and science, not at least as a member of the research project Art and Biology in the Age of the Digital Experiment, which is led by colleagues of mine at the Zurich University of Art. So please welcome Gabriella Kramersberger.
Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for these two very interesting entries to the timeline, so techno society and trading. And I know that trading has become so fast that it makes a difference if your computer is closer to the trading center than if it's far. That's over, okay. When Armin asked me to contribute an entry to this timeline, I was thinking about it. I was also thinking about computer trading. I didn't know that you did it. But I decided for talking about something which I have done a lot of research on it, and is something which is, I think, not at the moment, but will become a major paradigm shift. And the idea is to use biology in order to produce everything we need in the future. This is called synthetic biology today. And even you can use cells to compute, and synthetic biologists say, okay, we will, in future, we don't need in silico computers anymore. We will use cells in order to compute. And I want to explain this a bit, what they are talking about. Of course, you know all the history of DNA coding or decoding, and that the DNA is identified with the idea of coding. It's a long story from the 1950s, 60s until up to today. And this is one of the algorithms the students, when they study microbiology, get, how DNA code is translated into proteins, because it's really deterministic. So you can say this line of these three letters are translated in this kind of amino acid. When we look at the labs of biotechnologists, molecular biologists, I have to say, then it's interesting that they are using computers a lot, because what they did, they use computer-aided design programs coming from architecture or machine building, and they introduce it into biology in order to develop new organisms on the computer. And here you see a typical interface of one of this. It's called tinker cell. So you tinker around with a cell, you design a completely new cell, then it is displayed the DNA code behind it, and then you can print the DNA code out, and you plug it into a so-called chassis, which is E. coli bacteria usually, and then you hope that this will work out, and then you have designed a new organism. The idea behind is something which is pretty much, people are doing in philosophy of science a lot of research about it, because it's really interesting, because you introduce all the logic of computing into the field of biology. So you say, we don't have living organisms, or we have cells, we have devices or systems, and the systems and devices, they consist of parts, and what we can design on the computer, this is the parts. And from these parts, you put together parts, and then you build a new system, which is a new organism in the way. And I hope the image makes clear what it is about. The interesting aspect why I present this here is when you ask who is interested in this kind of biology, it's not only the scientists, but what you see is that this is the new big business, obviously, in Silicon Valley. And you have companies investing a lot of money in this new development. Google, of course, but also Microsoft. And Microsoft has this very nice slogan. It's meant a bit ironically. So programming life, using genetic devices to reprogram cell behavior and improve health, agriculture, and energy. Because it said if you can program a cell in that way that it produces a specific protein, which already happens for a specific drug, then you can use the same cell in order to produce biofuel, for example, or to produce proteins, which then you build together and you have a schnitzel. So this is one of the ideas, that we don't need to kill cows anymore, but that we can grow it in the lab. When you look behind the companies, so the mix, in particular in the US, the mix between companies, research institutions, and public service centers, then it becomes really a bit weird. I have here, you see Microsoft on the top, and you see another company, it's a bit small, I hope you can see it, Synthetic Genomics, it's the name. It's the company of Craig Venter. I think you know about Craig Venter. He's the person who wanted to decode the human genome in competition with the public institutions. And in his company, you see companies like ExxonMobil or BP, so oil companies, investing a lot of money in this business. You see, I don't see it at the moment, Novartis, for example, and Monsanto, which is very, very active in this business. And what you also see on the right side above is the DARPA. And when you know about the history of computing and the history of IT, then you know that the DARPA, the Defense Agency program of the United States, has played an important role in the development of IT and the computer and everything we know today about computing. And the DARPA for 2 or 3 years has founded the Biological Office in order to support all the developments leading to biological computing and synthetic biology. And when you ask, so we can use this organism in future, and some are used already today in order to produce some proteins, then you see a lot of research also that these organisms can be modified genetically in that way that you can use it for computing. One of the very first so-called synthetic designs was the repressilator by Elowitz and Leibler in 2000, and they used 3 genes which inhibited them, so gene A inhibited gene B and B inhibited gene C, so it had a negative feedback loop, and a negative feedback loop is always a gate in a way. So you can construct gates when you are able to construct these negative feedback loops. So they used DNA, they programmed it, they plugged it into a chassis in a E. coli bacteria, and then they had a kind of an oscillator. This is why it's called repressilator. And you see here on the one hand the model, how it should oscillate, and of course, because it's living cells, it doesn't oscillate this nicely, but it oscillates in a way, so it was the proof, or the crucial experiment to show that you can do this. And here we have the same problem like we heard before in economics, steady state equilibrium, called a steady state in this field. It's the same mathematical theory behind what you presented, so it's really fascinating that you can use the same equations. And you can create such an oscillator if you create an environment for this cell which is not too stable, but a bit unstable, but not completely chaotic. And I cannot go into details, but it's very fascinating how they do it. And just recently, another very known person in this play, Drew Andy, they developed something which they call transcriptor, and a transcriptor is really they try to model with cells all the logical gates we have in a computer. And they say it is working, so it is working for a bit of a time, but it's just the beginning what we see here. And I like to quote him, I hope I see it. So in an interview he said that we are going to be able to put computers inside any living cell you want, any place you want, a little bit of logic, a little bit of computation, a little bit of memory. We are going to be able to do that. So when we talk about environmentalism, we have to see that in future we can really eat these things, the computing cells, digest them, and they really become part of the environment. I don't know what happens if we eat them, but it can easily happen that we do that. This is an image from their paper about all the gates they constructed with living cells. And in the same year nearly, a Harvard biologist, they said, okay, we have the first DNA storage. So this image explains how the storage works. You have on the one side the red thing is a 19-bit address block, and on the other hand you have the storage, the blue one. So you use the 4 bases of the DNA in order to say T and G is 1 and A and C is 0. You encode it and you can decode it. For encoding, you use this DNA sequencer or the DNA printer I showed you before. And for decoding, for reading out what you have coded, you can use very, very cheap lab-on-chip technology today. and then you have a nice storage. So in 1 gram of 1 gram of DNA, you can store 700 megabytes of information. And what they did, they stored a book they have written, and they made 7 million copies of this book. So it's the most copied book in the world. And the name of the book is Read Genesis, which is interesting to know what they have in mind. This is the timeline. Then I suggested to the timeline project. So the transcriptor is an entry, the DNA storage is an entry, the repressilator I showed from 2000 is an entry. But of course, this is not completely new. So there is a lot of history in the background about wetware oscillating systems in the 70s. You have computer simulations, the first computer simulation in the 50s. You have the open system theory, which talks about organisms as steady state systems, which comes from an Austrian biologist called Ludwig von Bertalanffy in the late 60s, but he was talking about this much earlier. You have the idea that organisms are thermodynamic entities, like the trading. The trading system is also a thermodynamic entity. And Erwin Schrödinger, whom you might know, he is very famous in quantum. He has introduced quantum computing. He talked about negative entropy. Then we see very interesting Claude Shannon. This was the reason why I wanted to do this entry, because Shannon is always known for the information theory, but he has written his PhD thesis on genetic algebra, one of the very early papers or books on combining biology and mathematics and computing. But the timeline goes much more back into the history. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele. What I'm quite fascinated about is that if we go across these 3 domains that on many levels are not really related. Right? They work according to their own dynamics. They have a different social, political, economic environment, different agendas, but we can still see that there are underlying kind of connected elements that they all build upon. So you can really think of them as providing different layers of an integrated environment, of a kind of an overarching logic. And so there are a few terms that you use that I think can be used interchangeably, or you use them, but it could also have been you using it. One is obviously the idea of risk, right, as a kind of a main organizing and planning principle. Then kind of connected to that, but not exactly the same, is obviously the idea of volatility as, again, something that is inherent for the system, and a lot of dynamics organize around that. And perhaps underneath all of that, then you again pointed out this idea of this problematic idea of the equilibrium. So on the one hand, it's something it's kind of an ideal, but also an impossible ideal. So if the market is in full equilibrium, it will fall apart, or it will stop, it will collapse. So
we know that now. That's the interesting thing. It's known now.
So for a long time, this was the ideal to be achieved, right? And now we suddenly realize that if this ideal is achieved, it will be the end of the story. And underneath all of that is a kind of a mathematical kind of almost kind of universal theory based on probability as its main kind of feature, and then has different histories. Lots of this is from physics and from thermodynamics, and then branches out into all kinds of application. And applied to that, we get ideas that we, have to cover with security entire probability space. So not just things that we can reasonably expect to happen, but everything that could possibly happen. So I wonder whether from your different points of view and if your different kind of research experience, you can see this in the same way that I listen to that now, being a researcher in none of these fields, as something that or a greater underlying logic that connects the different strands around possible themes like this.
I think that what's so specific about risk in the field that I'm researching is that I would go as far as to say that financial markets, if you think of their mode of production, what do they produce? Their mode of production is the production of risk. Why? And I don't mean that in a moralistic sense, like, oh, so much risk, and now we have the next crisis, blah, blah, whatever. The reason, I think, has a lot to do, for example, with a distinction between uncertainty and risk, like Knightian uncertainty. That's a very important economist that wrote a book, 1921, Uncertainty, Risk, and Profit. And what he did in that book, and that's something that is still activated to a large degree in financial markets, is that uncertainty is something we cannot say anything about. No, it's the unknown unknown, so to say. We don't know what the future will be. Risk, however, is a quantifiable moment of that uncertain world, so we can speak about it. Well, risk is a quantifiable uncertainty that we talk about. So the more risk options, quantified enunciations, so to say, descriptions, statements we have that are traded, the more, at least that is certainly a promise or a claim of financial markets, the more we can say about the future, the more we tend to think that we control the future. Risk is a positive aspect in finance. Without risk, nothing would happen. No trading would happen, right? So there are three movements in finance. One is speculation, the other one is hedging, the third one is arbitrage. So you have that kind of moving together of three circulations. One of them means accepting risk positively, the other one means hedging against risk, and the third one is looking for those elements where you can make a profit without risk. And they always work together. And at least they have done that in as long as there was the paradigm of probability kind of like really alive. I think to some degree we're kind of really hitting the end of that on many, many levels. There is a writer that comes from finance as a philosopher. Some of you might have heard of him. His name is Elia Yash. And I think if you look at the two book titles, he has two books, major books, unreadable books, actually, unreadable books. One is called The Blank Swan, but the subtitle is The End of Probability. The second one, which is more recent, is The Medium of Contingency. And for him, a specific form of writing is the actual methodology to deal with contingency in derivative finance, so to say. I think that is, unfortunately, Eli Ayash is someone who is very adamant in coming up with a philosophy of the market, but I think we can think through his work also through other social fields, and I think they can be useful for that. And if we look at, I said Trump before, I'm still under shock, obviously, after going through this experience, but I think in a sense Trump is quite an example for that, because if you look at the discussions after the election, and we've known that in Europe, of course, we've seen that too, that all the polling, and polling is probability, kind of like applied, doesn't work anymore. We have all these fat tails all the time in probabilistic terms. That means all the things which are actually improbable happen all the time. So you can't really use probability anymore, but what you can use, and that I think people like Trump do very well, to use the terms of Ayash, but not in his sense, of course, is they write volatility. What, Trump, with his writing Twitter and Twitter as a code itself of writing is really surfing the volatility curve. So he's always ahead of everyone else who really believes in probability, where he can never box in the event that someone like Trump or others create at that same moment. So on many different layers, I think, not just in these kind of political perspectives, we hit this kind of problematics of probability, and I think big data already operates in a very, very different paradigm.
Before I hand over to you, I want to remind everyone there's, I think, a microphone, and if you have any question, comments, after the two Gabriele and Jutta had the chance to respond, we open the discussion to everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe only brief, also maybe to give the audience a chance to ask question. And maybe this fits to what Gerald said in the end, because what I found thinking about Techno Security, there's a very, talking again of books, an interesting book by Louise Amour, and the title is, and this is a readable book, The Logics of Possibility. So I wonder, and I would be interested how Gabriele, I mean, if you could talk about your field, about the relation of, if it makes sense, of probabilities and possibilities, because in security studies, I think many people make the claim, and that's what I tried to say before, is that it's no more causal logic, because probability still works in the register or in a regime of causality, I would say. So you make calculation about the probability, and I mean, insurances did this for the last, I don't know, 200 years or so. But thinking about unknown unknowns, you can't work with this traditional, yeah, in a way, traditional logic of probability, because there were these commissions, I think, of 9/11 and also of the commission for the terror attack in London. And that's why I said imagination becomes such an important issue, because they more or less said we need to use our imagination to think of the most future, or the future most not probable, but terrible terror attack. And then it starts about traditional ways of rationality. So what can you handle? What are you fighting against? Are you thinking about a probable threat? Or are you starting to working with weird science fiction scenarios? And I found actually one research project funded by the German Ministry of Education and Research, where they paid scientists for imagining of the most improbable scenarios that might happen. And I mean, normally I think you would think science fiction writers are getting paid for that, and now scientists are getting, social scientists, computer scientists are getting paid for thinking about these kind of scenarios. I mean, this started quite earlier. I mean, with the, you say, in the Cold War, when they were thinking about nuclear war, and they also had problems, how can we model nuclear war, because we don't have any experiences, we can't make experiments, and then it also starts with this worst case scenarios and computer simulation. I think Gabriele could also talk a little about that. But it's interesting how it really shifts from probability to possibility. And now maybe I give over to Gabriele if there are no questions, because I'm really interested in this shift from probability to possibility. And there comes also this tinkering, and maybe I will ask Gabriele later, because I was also intrigued by this tinker cell, because tinkering is, I think, really a key thing in recent technoscience, not only recent, but in technosciences.
I think the possibility is the right word, because possibility, because but it's not so new. When you think about the book of Hermann Kahn, Thinking the Unthinkable, in order to think the nuclear first attack, what does it mean? It's an old idea, and what we see today is that because to forecast on the basis of probabilities has become difficult in some areas, these scenario techniques have become very important. And they really date back to Herman Kahn and the Rand Corporation. So think about climate change. I've done a lot of work on climate models and climate change. Of course, climate models try to predict or to project. They don't talk about predictions. They talk about projections. They try to project what happens in 2100, but the conditions are so unsecure that maybe something completely different happens. And therefore they develop scenarios in order to make sure that we see what can happen in the worst case. But there is an interesting underlying story, I think, because from a mathematical or logical point of view, possibilities is something even Leibniz was very fascinated by, that you can think about every case. So you combine every possibility, which is each other possibility, in order to get aware about every case. And this is something which is part of your computer trading, fast computer trading, but it's also part of this, what I presented, because what you do, you design organisms, you try out every combination of the DNA code you can think about it. You can do it, of course, only with computers. And for me, this is the intrinsic computer logic we see now applied in a lot of areas, and even in more areas. And this, you can think about, it's a new form, I don't know if you can use the word, a new form of computational colonialization of reality, because now we see it in biology, we saw it on the markets, we see it on ourselves, and this data mining to find out every possibility which is possible and the computer can compute. This is why we talk about big data today, because if you want to compute every possibility, you get a lot of possibilities and a lot of data. And that is one of the biggest problems. Then later to get order or to get an idea or pattern in these possibilities. But I think this is what we are facing maybe in all kind of areas, and where we see what next area will face the maniac of possibilities.
I think down here is a question. And here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Johanna Zuleta, and I came from London. I am from Artefacto magazine. I want to know two things. I wonder, this lineal project you were talking about, is it possible to see it? Where is that? And also, we're discussing a lot about these futuristic things, but I also wonder the human element of it. We're talking about biology, but how does this interact also with our kind of the emotions? I don't know, I have this dichotomy, not dichotomy, but these very two extremes in me, because on one hand, I'm kind of like I come from a traditional family in a way, and on the other hand, I completely fit into what you're discussing and saying. But how do you marry those two things of the science and the emotions? And where is this future going in that sense? I don't know if that question makes sense. I don't know.
What project was she asking for?
The lineal photograph.
That's very simple. I can answer this. Now the other one is for you. The project is shown until Sunday at the Neue Gesellschaft für Bildende Kunst, which is artist-run space at Oranienburger Straße 29 in Kreuzberg. So there you can see kind of the physical display of that. Okay. So that's the easy part.
Yes.
The more difficult part, as a philosopher, I take over maybe. I mean, I want to ask you this. What we see is that it's the anthropomorphization of computation, of everything which has to do with computation. I want to explain it a bit. 70% of the communication in the internet is machine-machine communication. the machines have become so fast, and we got a very good example that we as humans are completely too slow to do anything anymore. This is what you experience at the moment. You maybe you text with somebody, or you use WhatsApp or whatever, and while you are sending your message to the other person and he or she thinks it's in real time, so much time for the computer has passed that he can do lots of analytics called on the fly, analytic on the fly. So what we see is that this, I like to talk about the parallel universe of the machines, and we see that this becomes stronger and stronger, this parallel universe of the machines, because and this is what also people refer to this word, technological unconsciousness, what Nigel Swift and Patricia Clough had talked about. And even because you talked about emotion, affective computing is the next big step. So you have we are monitored all the time. We have the software in order to recognize our faces. And the same software is now equipped with all these, with the algorithms in order to analyze our emotions. And in particular, Facebook, they run at the moment on all the images ever put on Facebook, this emotion analyzing software. But what kind of emotion is this? It's not how I feel, it's what computers tell me, what obviously I am feeling. So again, humans are sorted out in a way.
Okay, could I come back on one
Yeah.
thing? Thank you. Because I think it's sane that we disconnect from technology at least a day a week, 2 days a week. People don't know how to disconnect from the phone, having dinner at the table, and that's just plain rude. But how do you also address this need for disconnecting from the machines?
I mean, you can criticize it, but maybe you as
I mean, I have a very different answer maybe to your question, because as I, in very, very brief words, we don't have much time, but as I told you before that Sylvia and me are doing this project with Hein Bodek, who is a whistleblower, right? So the reason why we do this, there is of course a conceptual background to all of that I call the aesthetics of resolution, and there's one figure that's very, very crucial in that I call the figure of the renegade. There could be an informant, there could be a whistleblower, whatever. The reason is we have no idea what's behind or inside the black box, right? Usually behind black boxes or inside black boxes are the next black box, no? And the conversation between black boxes, the listening to black boxes means extreme experts that are all not allowed to talk about it. So how do we have a black box transparent? Or how do we make the black box speak? By having someone from within the black box speak to us, which also means that we have to be people that are able to understand what this black box speaker, no? Like Hein Bodek as a whistleblower, tells us. No? And that is something only humans can do. That no algorithm will talk about that. No algorithm will be the traitor that becomes the educator for the public, right? So that's one way where humans come and have a very, very, very important role.
Maybe I can add a small point, because also Felix asked about this. I think I would also add, I mean, this is kind of the positive story about the human doing what the human can do, a computer can't. But I mean, I was talking at the end of my talk about the save button on Facebook, and I think it's also, we are kind of part of the machine, and okay, this is also part of the zeitgeist. We can't jump out of our time and just not being touched of this. But I mean, this is also part, I mean, how we are also emotionally intrigued by specific mechanisms. For example, hanging on to interconnectivity, because it gives you a promise of being part of something, of not being alone in a mass society, and these kind of things. So I think it's very much connected. It's not only the machine, and that's the rational, technical part, and then we have our bodies and the feelings. I think it's very much intertwined. But Felix wanted to...
No, there was another question.
Yeah, super. I think you partly answered it already, Gerald Nestler, with the last statement. I just wanted to know about the problem when algorithms are causing problems, how to analyze these, Can you expand on that a little? Can it be done only by other algorithms, or will we have regulation algorithms, or how is that gonna take off? Thank you.
I have no idea what we will have. But what I think is, I mean, when we go along the developments and, you know, develop our projects through our interests in them, kind of like ourselves living with these volatilities, so to say, what kind of happens that sometimes stuff appears and that might be interesting, and within that specific world that I'm researching, what has happened is that it's not just the algorithms themselves that actually produce these kind of inconsistencies or asymmetries. It is the collaboration, if you like, between the algorithm, the regulator, and the market center. So it means that the necessity, the urgency, the intrinsic necessity of making profit is so strong that it completely corrupts fields easily. Financial markets now are in that instance totally corrupted. And this is proven through the whistleblower cases that went through with fines. There have been fines now for market centers for using order types which are not licit or which were not communicated to others. So there's all these different kinds of inconsistencies and fraud, so to say. So it's not about looking at the algorithm. I think we should really kind of say goodbye to directional ways of looking at things. We're so used to these directional ways, you know, looking at something that is there and taking the next step. We need to find ways of looking at stuff very non-directionally. And that means, you know, ideas or reality might come from wherever, from somewhere. We need to be aware or we need to kind of try to find the sensors that we learn reading these kind of things. So maybe I can answer it differently. But, you know, what's very, very specific about these developments, and I think not just in finance, but also in these other practices, is they are not representational. Power used to be representational. It was all about representation. At least in finance, I can really delineate that. Finance doesn't give a damn about representation. There are no nice images that tell you something or tell you why it's so powerful. It's performative, and it has changed the world to a performative one through its performative acts. So what we need to learn is to develop sensors, even physical sensors, intuitive sensors, to see and understand performative structures, performativity, the way we have learned to understand representation.
No more, what was it? No more talk, all action, right? That was Trump from his inaugural speech, right? So, to bring it back to the happy side again. Since we are very advanced in time, I propose to, if there are any comments or questions, that we will simply collect them and then have them as a way of closing round. There's one over here. Where do you get the microphone?
Hi, thank you for the fascinating range of talks. Probably not time to answer it now, but just want to ask about the idea of pleasure and surveillance, which seems incredibly, pleasure and surveillance, it seems incredibly fascinating, particularly at the moment when it seems we're having radically increasing amounts of state-based digital surveillance, but a massive lack of resistance to it from us, you know, the populaces. Maybe not so much in Germany, but certainly in the UK, digital data bills, etc. There must be some kind of psychic drive where we enjoy that. There's something, I don't know, the lack of God. Maybe it's a new thing, but if you could say something on that.
I think we have time for another comment or question that was over there. No? Okay, then we start our closing round on the psychic side.
Yes, I think that's what I briefly just tried to point at. I think that I mean, also in Germany, I think we really enjoy also being part of, how can I say, this surveillance machine, machines talking to machines, machines looking at us, machines categorizing us, profiling us, and so on. And I think there is a specific, or there are promises in it. As I said, like interconnectivity, the crowd wisdom. So I think these are some of the promises that come with surveillance, or the possibilities of possibilities. So if we all connect, I think there are a lot of these kind of promises in, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's no resistance, or only few resistance. But maybe it's also, it's a Greek word, apatheia. I think it's both. I didn't want to focus only on the pleasure. I mean, for me it's important to say there's top-down, but there's also bottom-up surveillance. But I think there's also some, I think there was a recent survey asking people in the EU whether they would not enjoy, but they were asking about what they would like in terms of communication, and I think 70% would have loved to have their communication encrypted in case it's not so difficult. I mean, PGP to use, I mean, needs some technical literacy, and not everybody wants to go into that. And even if you know it, I hate it because it pops all the time up when you send an email, and sometimes I switch it off because I don't want to be asked all the time. So, I mean, it's both. I think there's an apatheia, there's a lot, not enough technical literacy, but I think there's also pleasure in surveillance. I think lots of different aspects. Sorry for not making it more easy.
I don't agree with what you said, Gerald, because I think we have to be very careful, because we don't have to develop sensors in order to adapt to the computational world, because it's what we experience at the moment pretty much. We are used more and more to the computational world, whatever it is, and we are forced to use to it. But the question is this really the right way? But this is another discussion. So I don't like to have this idea that I develop the sensors, you know, for understanding this machinic worlds anymore. But this is my personal view on it.
What I meant is, of course, that we are able to differentiate and know what it tells us, so we can do something about it, right? Not so much in adapting to it, because we adapt much more easily by just giving ourselves to that. Right? I think this is also that the question is about. But I'm very, very short on that, because I think actually Black Mirror sometimes very nicely deals with the libidinal side of the stuff that's coming. So maybe we watch Black Mirror together and talk about it after that.
On that note, I'm closing this discussion. I would very much like to thank Jutta, Gabriele, and Gerald. Normally, moderating a discussion is kind of a tedious task because you hand out times and so on. But I think I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. So thank you very much for coming, both the panelists and you as the audience.